Hi, Mizzo here. It's a beautiful day. I've got my camera set up, so I think it's kind of doing like a rainbow here. Can you see this way here? Can you see the rainbow? um, Welcome. I want to talk about Publix today, and I'm loving this topic. I think I really dig topics that are so obvious and are so ingrained in what we understand to be life, and we just sort of take for granted that that's how things are, that's how they exist. And then I read a textbook and it sort of says, oh, this is why it's like this, and this is how it is. And that's how I feel about Publix, right? When I'm reading about here are traditional Publix, here are non traditional Publix, here are the types of Publix, that kind of stuff. And then I'm looking around and I'm able to see that and all of the things, from my Girl Scout troop to um, my speech team in college to a choir I was once in to my family unit, right? They all sort of start to make sense to any job I've ever had, right? When I waitressed and all of us employees, right? They start to make sense as a public. And I love that, right? So the text does a great job of laying out different types of Publix, and I'm not going to go much into that because I think there's so many different types and kind of tracking that, just take good notes on that. What I want to discuss is what do we need to know about Publix, specifically in reference to public relations, if we're doing public relations work. And so uh, my specific text lays out 7 sort of things, and then I'm going to give you a couple bonus ones. So I'm going to talk about these. So, some of them are pretty obvious. How much can the public influence our organization's ability to achieve our goals? So, what's the impact? So, how much does this public have an impact on me? What is the public's stake or value in its relationship with our organization? This becomes important because we've talked a lot about relationships and how relationships function in PR. And for me, I'm a pretty visual person. So it's like where, either distance wise and impact wise, if I'm the organization, where is this public, right? Is this public voters? And they, have a stake because if they vote for whatever I'm doing, then they get that in return. Is it someone who's giving me money, right? So they have an investment in my organization? Is it someone who's benefiting from my product or my service or act? And so what is the stake or value uh, in that relationship? Who are the opinion leaders and decision makers for this public? This is pretty important because I think we again have sort of stereotypes as to who the leaders are and how that happens. But this is sort of pointing, can we identify the people in power? They're not using the word power, but do we know who's in power and do we know, you know, how they are in that public? Uh, what's very interesting there is, does the public have any sort of set organization? So it's been really interesting. I don't know if you've been following. I don't know how you couldn't be paying attention to all of the election stuff that's already happening. But there was an article that came out, I believe last week, that talked about the endorsements that are coming out for the Democratic side, and all of the organizations in this, for our intents purposes, the publics that are endorsing Hillary Clinton are publics that are made up of a structure where there was a board or some sort of leadership that voted. And the endorsements coming out for Bernie Sanders were made up by publics where they had a member vote. So in cases where there was masses or members or the individuals of the publics voting, those organizations or publics supported Bernie Sanders or endorsed him. And in the cases where there were the leaders or the opinion decision makers, in this case, making the vote, they were endorsing or supporting Hillary Clinton. So the article talked about sort of the different nuances there and how that was very representative of each of those candidates' campaigns. But how cool for our intensive purposes to look at not only how those publics function and how those are connected, but also how it's connected to the opinion leaders and the decision makers. Um, Next, what is the demographic profile of the public? So, what are their ages? What are their marriage statuses? What are their sexual preferences? So many religion. Basically, what are their social standpoints, and how does that influence how they behave, what they value, what they think? The next one kind of goes with that. The psychographic profile of the public. What are their attitudes, values, opinions, beliefs? And how are those connected? I think those two, the demographic and the psychographic, they go together, right? And I'm going to touch back on that in a second, as far as how that I think connects to culture. But that's just important to kind of know who you're dealing with. I think uh, um, mm, in certain cases, I'll use age as an example. In certain cases, I think age and specifically generation has a lot to deal. So if I have an organization and I'm dealing with a specific public, especially with technology use, I mean, I'm going to want to know the demographic age of that public, and that's going to help inform me about how tech savvy they are. So let's say I want to employ different media uses for them. If they're of an older generation, I might not suggest or want to employ Snapchat. But if they are of a younger age, based on their demographic information, that might be included in one of the things I want to pitch. And you can't always use that to see how, I mean, some of this really falls into stereotypes, but you can kind of use that. I mean, we are sense-making creatures, right? Like, we're using this to sort of figure out and judge and know. And then, what is the public's opinion of our organization? And what is the public's opinion, if any, of the issue in question? So again, sort of knowing, it deals back with relationships. How do they feel about you? How do they feel? I just judged a speech tournament this weekend, and the public, that runs the speech tournament is called the Valley Forensics League, and the Valley Forensics League has this very big history in the Red River Valley area. But the membership weans, and it's always, since teams have been lost over the years, there's sort of a constant narrative about how we're going to keep up membership, and do people drive, and so there's this big conversation. And there was a while where the tournaments that this public ran were long and awful, and you'd be there late, and they weren't well run. And this was years before I came and started coaching and being in the organization. And so then it shifted. New coaches came in. It got a lot better, but people would still talk about, oh, the tournaments are so long. Oh, and those of us in the public were going, no, we've changed that. But we knew that other publics, in this case universities, felt that way about our organization. And then, of course, the issue at hand, the topic, the thing that's being discussed or handled. So those are the 7 that my text lays out, and I want to throw a little bit more in there about context, power, and privilege. Many of those questions get at this, but I think when you're thinking about publics, and organizations or groups of individuals that are making up a public, when you're thinking about these questions, you want to kind of keep an eye on or a thought to the context clues, right? And specifically the public and the questions about the public in context with our larger culture, society, state, etc. And so, you're not asking these questions in a bubble. You're asking these questions in connection to what's happening on a larger stage, or what's happening in a social, cultural climate. And a lot of that really does deal with power and privilege, specifically money, right? When you're thinking about who has the stake, what are the opinions, what are the relationships, a lot of that deals in our capitalistic democratic culture. A lot of that deals with power, specifically financial power. And so how are those things connected? What's being handled there? Right? Is the public a profit organization? Is the public a nonprofit? Does the public even deal with money? So I did theater for many, many years, and I always jokingly called it no budget theater. So instead of low budget theater, it was no budget theater, right? We didn't have any money, right? So we took donations, but we were all gathered putting on a play for the same. I mean, we were a public, but that was very different than when I did community theater, right? Which was very different when I have done professional theater or academic theater, right? So looking at these questions as context clues and then how they connect to that power and privilege and that state in society, right? Um, and specifically, what are the other things happening that affect the answers to these questions? So one common one that I thought of was, is it an election year? Right? Because the answer to these questions about many governmental publics, for example, will change based on whether it's an election year or not. Um, right now in academia, there's a lot of discussion about budget cuts. And so we functioned very differently as a public. The specific universities functioned very different as a public 5 years ago versus now in a completely different financial status. So looking at these, do you see how power and privilege and culture and also, right? So let's take a church as a public, right? So a group who is surrounded by a religious context. Looking at them in the United States is going to be very different than looking at a public like that in India, a public like that in Iceland, a public like that in Australia, right? Because of the different powers, privileges, contexts, those publics and the answers to these questions really do shift and change. So hopefully that gives you an idea of publics and how they function and how we can sort of start to think about them, analyze, question, and eventually start deeply thinking and critically thinking about them to help us build our public relations skills. Have a beautiful day.